What if Poland, instead of fighting Ukraine, chose to free Ukraine in 19? What if Józef Piłsudski extended his hand to the Ukrainians before it was too late? Today, we're rewriting one of history's most haunting what-ifs. And trust me, the effects are far-reaching. On November 1st, 1918, as Austria-Hungary crumbled into dust, Ukrainian nationalists in Lviv made their move. They proclaimed the West Ukrainian People's Republic. For one beautiful moment, it looked like the Ukrainian dream might finally come true. They controlled eastern Galicia, they had oil fields in Drohobych, and they assembled the Ukrainian Galician army from former Austrian soldiers. But the Poles weren't having it. Lviv was a Polish cultural capital. The city was majority Polish, and the Polish government in Warsaw, they saw eastern Galicia as rightfully theirs, and that resulted to an immediate vicious war. By January 1919, the Ukrainians had 43,000 troops and actually managed to surround Lviv on three sides. They cut the water supply, they cut electricity. Italian observers reported that the Ukrainians were fighting with the courage of the doomed, because that's exactly what they were. Doomed. The Ukrainian Galician army was disciplined, well-organized and motivated. In February 1919, they launched the Wojciechowski offensive. They pushed at the Poles back 120 to 150 kilometers. They almost liberated Lviv twice, but every time the Ukrainians were winning, the Entente powers, the coalition led by Britain and France, intervened. They forced ceasefires and demanded negotiations. Why? Because France needed Poland strong. They needed Poland as a buffer against both Germany and Soviet Russia. But Ukrainian independence? That wasn't part of their geopolitical chess game. Then came General Joseph Haller, who arrived from France with 68,000 fresh troops, fully equipped with French weapons, French training, and French orders to crush the Ukrainians. On May 14, 1919, Poland launched a massive offensive. The Ukrainians fought brilliantly. They held on until June, but by then they were out of ammunition, they were outnumbered 2-1, and they were alone. On July the 16th to 18th, 1919, the Ukrainian Galician army, composed of 80,000 men and 100,000 civilians, retreated across the Zbruch River. They fled into the territory of the Ukrainian People's Republic, which was already being squeezed between Bolshevik Russia and Denikin's White Army. Eastern Galicia fell to Poland, and Ukraine's chance at independence went up in smoke. What followed was even worse. The Galician forces that crossed the Zbruch tried to help Simon Petliura's Ukrainian People's Republic fight the Bolsheviks. But by autumn 1919, they were decimated by typhus. Only 7% remained combat-ready. By November, desperate and betrayed, some Galician units even briefly allied with the White Russian General Denikin, who hated Ukrainian independence almost as much as the Bolsheviks did. By December 1919, Ukrainian leader Simon Petlura had fled to Poland. In April 1920, he signed the Treaty of Warsaw with Piłsudski, officially giving up Galicia and Volhynia to Poland in exchange for Polish military support. Poland then launched the Kiev offensive against the Bolsheviks and briefly captured Kiev in May 1920. However, the Soviets pushed back. By October, it was over. The Treaty of Riga split Ukraine between Poland and Soviet Russia. Ukraine disappeared from the map for 70 years. During this period, between 50,000 and 200,000 Jews died in pogroms, many at the hands of various Ukrainian forces, desperate, disorganized, and drowning in anti-Semitic propaganda. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians died in the fighting. And then came the Soviet nightmare. The terror famine of 1932 to 1933, the Great Purge, the forced collectivization. Stalin would kill millions. The Polish-Ukrainian War was, according to contemporary Polish analysts, one of the main reasons Ukraine failed to achieve independence. The Galician army, disciplined, immune to Bolshevik propaganda, and 75,000 strong, could have turned the tide against the Reds. Instead, they wasted their strength fighting Poland. So that's what happened. Now let's tear it all down and rebuild it. Our point of divergence happens in February 1919, during the Vovchuki offensive. The Ukrainian Galician army is pushing hard toward Lviv. They're winning, and critically, they haven't yet fully alienated the Entente powers. In our timeline, this is where Piłsudski doubles down on crushing Ukraine. But what if he made a different calculation? Here's the thing about Piłsudski. He was a pragmatist. His ultimate goal wasn't just Polish nationalism. It was creating a federation of states strong enough to resist both Germany and Russia. He called it the Intermarium concept, a bloc from the Baltic to the Black Sea that could stand between the two empires. In our timeline, Piłsudski only came around to this idea after defeating Ukraine, when it was too late. But what if someone convinced him earlier? What if a shocking military setback made him realize that fighting Ukraine was strategic suicide? Remember, in February 1919, the Russian Civil War was in full swing. Lenin's Red Army was still fighting on multiple fronts. If Polish intelligence correctly assessed that the Whites would lose and that Bolshevik Russia would emerge as a superpower, well, suddenly destroying Ukraine looks idiotic. So here's our scenario. In mid-February 1919, during the Barthélemy Mission negotiations, Piłsudski makes an offer. Poland proposes a military alliance with the West Ukrainian People's Republic with the following terms. Ukraine recognizes Polish control over Lviv city itself, with significant Ukrainian autonomy. The oil fields of Drohobych and Borislav go to a joint Polish-Ukrainian Economic Commission. Poland and Ukraine form a defensive alliance against Soviet Russia, and Polish and Ukrainian forces launch a coordinated offensive to secure Ukrainian independence from the Bolsheviks. The Ukrainian leadership accepts this proposal because they have no choice and they're running out of ammunition. The Entente is against them, and Piłsudski is offering them something no one else will, a fighting chance. So by March 1919, Polish and Ukrainian forces stop fighting each other and turn east. The combined force is formidable. Poland contributes approximately 70,000 troops, including Haller's fresh divisions. The Ukrainian Galician army adds another 60,000 combat-ready soldiers. Together, they form a coalition force of 130,000 men. But numbers alone don't tell the story. The real advantage is strategic. The Ukrainian Galician army knows the territory so well. They have local support in central and eastern Ukraine. And crucially, they're not viewed as foreign invaders the way the Poles are. In April 1919, the offensive begins. Polish forces advance through Belarus and Volhynia, pushing back the scattered Bolshevik units. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Galician army, reinforced with Polish artillery and ammunition, drives toward Kiev alongside Petliura's Ukrainian People's Republic forces. The Bolsheviks weren't ready for this. In our timeline, they could pick off the Ukrainians piecemeal because the Ukrainians were fighting on three fronts: Poland, White Russia, and the Reds. But now, the Ukrainians have ammunition. They have Polish air support with 150 planes. They have coordinated logistics. By June 1919, Kiev falls to the Ukrainian forces, but unlike in our timeline's brief 1920 offensive, they hold it. Polish forces establish a defensive line along the Dnieper River, providing a shield against Soviet counterattacks while the Ukrainians consolidate control. How about Denikin's White Army? In our timeline, they occupied Ukraine in late 1918 and early 1919. They are fighting everyone, but in this timeline, they face a united Polish-Ukrainian front. When Denikin tries to advance north from the Caucasus, he runs into reinforced Ukrainian positions backed by Polish heavy artillery. Denikin's forces can't break through. By autumn 1919, the Western Allies notice. Britain and France, initially opposed to the Polish-Ukrainian alliance, realize that this coalition is actually winning. They're pushing back the Bolsheviks. They are containing Denikin. and they're creating exactly the kind of anti-communist buffer state that the Allies want. In September 1919, the Entente powers recognized the Ukrainian People's Republic as an independent state. Poland and Ukraine signed the Treaty of Lviv, formally establishing their borders and creating the Polish-Ukrainian Defensive Alliance. Here's a detail that matters more than you'd think. In our timeline, the Ukrainian Galician army was decimated by typhus in late 1919, losing 93% of its combat strength. This happened because they were constantly on the move, retreating, operating in unsanitary conditions without stable supply lines. In this timeline, they have Polish medical support, they have fixed positions, they have clean water and proper field hospitals. Typhus still hits them, but the mortality rate is much lower, maybe lower than 70%. This means that going into winter 1919, Ukraine still has a functional army of 40,000 to 50,000 men. The year 1920 brings new challenges. The Bolsheviks, having defeated most of the White forces by early 1920, turned their full attention to Ukraine. A massive Red Army offensive, led by Mikhail Tukhachevsky, crashes into the Polish-Ukrainian lines. This is the real test. In our timeline, the Battle of Warsaw in August 1920 saved Poland. But Poland was fighting alone, and the Bolsheviks nearly won. In this timeline, the battle unfolds differently. The Red Army pushes hard into Ukraine and Belarus, initially making gains, but the Polish-Ukrainian alliance holds several key advantages. The Ukrainians are fighting for their homeland, not just supporting Polish interests. Polish forces aren't stretched thin defending the long eastern border alone. The Allies, now invested in Ukraine's success, provide more weapons and supplies, and the local population in Ukraine actively supports the defenders against the Bolsheviks. By July 1920, the Soviet offensive stalls short of Warsaw. In August, the Polish-Ukrainian counteroffensive, coordinated across an 800-kilometer front, catches the overextended Red Army off guard. The Battle of Warsaw still happens, but it's part of a larger victory. By September, the Bolsheviks are in full retreat, so the Treaty of Minsk, signed in October 1920, establishes the borders. Poland gets the territories west of the Bug River. Ukraine secures everything east to the Dnieper, including Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa. The border is farther east than in our timeline's Treaty of Riga. After years of war, the newly independent Ukraine faces huge challenges. The economy is shattered, and Ukraine has to build state institutions almost from scratch. But Ukraine has something it never had before: stability and international recognition. The 1920s see massive reconstruction efforts, funded partly by Poland, partly by French investment, and partly by Ukrainian agricultural exports. The government, led by a coalition of Petliura's Ukrainian National Republic forces and the Galician politicians, establishes a parliamentary democracy. It's messy and flawed, with constant tensions between Galician Catholics, Orthodox Ukrainians, and minority groups. But it's functional. The Jewish question becomes critical. In our timeline, the Ukrainian revolutionary period was marked by horrific pogroms. In this timeline, the Ukrainian government, desperate for international legitimacy and under pressure from the Allies, takes a harder line against anti-Semitism. Officers who commit pogroms face court-martial. It's not perfect, violence still happens, but the scale is vastly reduced. Jewish communities, while wary, become integrated into the new Ukrainian state. Ukrainian culture flourishes. The 1920s see an explosion of Ukrainian literature, theatre, and art. Kiev becomes a cultural capital, rivaling Warsaw and Bucharest. The Ukrainian language is standardized and taught in schools. National identity solidifies. By 1925, Ukraine is an established European nation, not wealthy, not powerful, but legitimate and independent. The Ukrainian Galician army evolves into a professional military force, trained by French advisors, with an officer corps that fought for independence and believes in protecting it. Now let's talk about the Soviet Union. Losing Ukraine is deadly for the Bolsheviks. In our timeline, conquering Ukraine gave the Soviets access to the breadbasket of Europe. Ukrainian grain fed Soviet cities during the critical early years. Ukrainian industrial capacity, like the factories of Kharkiv and Donetsk, became central to Stalin's industrialization plans. Without Ukraine, the Soviet Union is 30% smaller in population and agricultural capacity. The first 5-year plan looks completely different. Stalin can't implement forced collectivization on the same scale because he doesn't control Ukrainian farmland. The terror famine of 1932 to 1933, the Holodomor that killed millions, doesn't happen in Ukraine because Ukraine isn't Soviet. Instead, famine strikes Russia itself harder. The Soviet economic model, already inefficient, becomes even more strained. Stalin still implements his purges and terror campaigns, but the Soviet Union of the 1930s is noticeably weaker than in our timeline. By the mid-1920s, the Polish-Ukrainian alliance expands. Lithuania, fearing Soviet expansion, joins. So does Romania, nervous about Bolshevik influences. By 1928, there's a formal intermarium pact among Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Romania, and potentially the Baltic states. This fundamentally changes European geopolitics. Instead of small, isolated nations that Stalin and Hitler can pick off one by one, Eastern Europe has a united front. The combined military forces of the Intermarium Pact in 1930 equal approximately 1.5 million soldiers. It may be not enough to threaten Germany or the USSR individually, but enough to make both pause. When Hitler comes to power in 1933, he faces a different strategic situation. In our timeline, Germany's path to war involved picking off Eastern European nations one by one. From Austria, Czechoslovakia to Poland, Hitler exploited their isolation and mutual distrust. In this timeline, Hitler faces the Intermarium Pact. When he demands Danzig in 1939, he's not just threatening Poland, he's threatening a bloc of nations with mutual defense agreements. Does this prevent World War II? No, of course not. Hitler was always going to start a war, but the war starts differently. Hitler, seeing that he can't easily divide the Intermarium, decides to strike earlier, perhaps 1937 or 1938, before rearmament is complete. He launches a surprise attack on Poland and Ukraine simultaneously, while also moving on Czechoslovakia. The Intermarium is caught off guard, but fights back. The Polish-Ukrainian forces, while not as well armed as Germany, are more coordinated in this timeline. Ukraine's military, trained by France and battle-hardened from 1919 to 20, is a legitimate fighting force. France and Britain honour their commitments to Poland, and World War II begins in 1937 or maybe 1938. But this earlier war sees Germany less prepared. The Wehrmacht hasn't fully modernized. The Soviet Union, under a weakened Stalin who lost Ukraine, is more cautious about intervention. The war is shorter but more chaotic. Germany makes early gains but overextends. Without being able to use Ukrainian resources and territory for their 1941 invasion of Russia, Germany's strategic options are limited. In August 1939, Stalin and Hitler try to negotiate their pact to divide Eastern Europe, but Ukraine is internationally recognized as an independent. Dividing Ukraine isn't as simple as it was in our timeline. When Germany demands territorial concessions from Ukraine, perhaps Galicia, to reunite with German-occupied Poland, Ukraine refuses. The Intermarium Pact mobilizes. France and Britain, seeing a united Eastern European front, provide more military support than they did historically. Hitler invades anyway in September 1939, but the invasion of Poland becomes a simultaneous invasion of Ukraine. The Wehrmacht fights on two major fronts immediately: the Soviet Union opportunistic as always, invades from the east. But now they're fighting the Ukrainian army, not just scattered Polish resistance. The opening months of World War II are far bloodier. But critically, Ukraine doesn't become a Nazi-occupied territory easily. The Ukrainian resistance, backed by a government in exile with actual international legitimacy, fights harder and longer. This is the most morally significant effect. In our timeline, German-occupied Ukraine became a major site of the Holocaust. Babi Yar, where 33,000 Jews were murdered in September 1941, was near Kiev. Millions died in Ukrainian territory. In this timeline, several factors change the Holocaust's trajectory in Ukraine. Theoretically, Ukraine has an established government with Jewish citizens who have full rights. When Germany invades, the Ukrainian government evacuates eastward with much of its population, including Jewish communities. Ukrainian partisan resistance is more organized and legitimate, operating with government sanction, and international attention on Ukraine means atrocities are reported faster. Does this stop the Holocaust? Unfortunately, no. The Nazis were always going to attempt genocide, but the scale in Ukraine specifically is reduced. Perhaps 30 to 40% fewer Jews die in Ukrainian territory because they evacuate earlier, because resistance networks are stronger, and because international observers are present. It's a horrifying calculus, but in a war where millions die, every life saved matters. When the war ends, let's say 1943 or 1944 in this timeline, the map of Europe looks different. Ukraine survives as an independent nation, though devastated by war. The Intermarium Pact nations, having fought together, emerge with stronger ties. The Soviet Union, having lost Ukraine in 1919 and never fully recovering economically, is a weaker power. Stalin may still try to expand westward after the war, but he faces a more united Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain forms farther east. Instead of dividing Germany and running through Warsaw, it might run along the Polish-Soviet border, with Ukraine on the western side. The Cold War dynamics also shift fundamentally. NATO expansion isn't necessary in the same way, because Eastern Europe already has defensive alliances. Ukraine becomes a founding member of the United Nations, a democratic nation aligned with the West, but maintaining complex relations with both NATO and the USSR. The Cold War in this timeline is more multipolar. You have the United States, the Soviet Union, and the Intermarium Pact as a third bloc. Ukraine becomes a crucial swing state. It's democratic, but not firmly in either camp. It trades with the West, but must maintain diplomatic relations with the USSR out of geographic necessity. The space race looks different. Ukrainian engineers and scientists who in our timeline worked for the Soviet program now work for a Ukrainian space agency or collaborate with the West. Maybe the first man in space is Ukrainian instead of Russian. Maybe the moon landing happens 2 years earlier because Ukrainian scientists contribute to NASA. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union doesn't result in Ukrainian independence because Ukraine has been independent for 70 years. Instead, it results in Ukraine becoming the dominant power in Eastern Europe almost by default. When Russia descends into chaos, Ukraine offers stability. Fast forward to the present 2026. In our timeline's 2026, Ukraine is fighting a brutal war against Russian invasion. In this alternate 2026, Ukraine is a prosperous EU member state, one of the largest agricultural exporters in Europe, with a population of perhaps 55 to 60 million, and a GDP per capita similar to Poland. The Ukrainian language and culture are strong. Kiev is a major European capital, and Ukrainian democracy, forged in the battles of 1919 and refined over a century, is robust. Russia in this timeline is smaller and weaker, having never absorbed Ukraine. Putin might still be autocratic, but without Ukrainian resources, Russia's military and economic power are diminished. The 2014 Crimean annexation never happens because Crimea has been Ukrainian for over a century. The world is different in subtle and profound ways. Millions who died in our timeline, in the Holodomor, in World War II, in the Cold War proxy conflicts, live full lives. Ukrainian scientists, artists and thinkers who were suppressed or killed in our timeline contribute to global culture and innovation. So what if Poland freed Ukraine in 1919? Everything changes. The Soviet Union never becomes the superpower it did. World War II happens differently, with potentially millions of lives saved. The Cold War is more complex, and Ukraine survives as an independent nation, contributing to European and global development for over a century. But this alternate history wasn't some distant possibility. This alternate history didn't require magic or time travel. This was a choice that real people in February 1919 could have made differently. Piłsudski and the Ukrainian leadership were so close to an alliance, but nationalist politics, Entente interference, and historical grievances pushed them toward war instead. The Polish-Ukrainian War was a choice, and that choice condemned millions to death and suffering over the next century. Maybe the most haunting question is why Poland didn't free Ukraine. The answer is probably the same reason conflicts continue today, because nations choose short-term gains over long-term cooperation. Because sometimes, even when everyone knows war is stupid, they fight anyway. Ukraine's independence was stolen in 1919 by forces that didn't even benefit from the theft. Poland got territories it would lose 20 years later. The Soviets got a population that resisted for 70 years. Germany got a battlefield that destroyed their armies. Nobody won. And yet, for one brief moment in February 1919, there was a different path. A path where Poland and Ukraine stood together, where the intermarium became real, where millions lived who died in our timeline. That's the real tragedy of alternate history. These scenarios were possible, and we missed them. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more what-if scenarios. And let me know in the comments, do you think the Polish-Ukrainian alliance could have realistically happened? What other consequences am I missing?